Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, on this podcast, you could be forgiven for thinking, when is this guy going to run out of ideas for new interviews about how tech is transforming our world? Well, you have nothing to worry about because we currently have 10 shows a week booked in until February, which should cover any potential cancellations we have on the horizon. And let me assure you, we have plenty of life left in this podcast hopper for 2020 and beyond. Now, with our mutual home planet Earth getting warmer and warmer each year, and not to mention overpopulation and shrinking resources, it's clear to me at least that we need to start taking sustainability seriously and start doing more with less. And surely technology's got to play a big part in that. Now, a company called Lighthouse is working to reduce carbon emissions across buildings. And most recently at Atlantic Terminal Mall and Atlantic Centre, they've managed to eliminate more than 7,600 tonnes of carbon emissions. The equivalent to planting a new Central Park every year for the next 10 years. So Lighthouse is actually on a mission to stop climate change by making it easy and profitable for building owners to eliminate carbon emissions caused by wasted energy. And their unique approach to efficiency production goes deep into buildings to uncover and continuously correct hidden inefficiencies that actually add up to meaningful financial value and carbon elimination that lasts. So they've already eliminated 8.5 power plants and generally deliver a 10 to 30% energy savings with a 10 to 30% ROI. That was more than enough to capture my attention. So I want to find out more about the tech and also the very human story behind this company. So I invite you to come with me all the way to California, where Brendan Milstein, CEO at Lighthouse, is waiting to speak with us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Brendan. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Brendan Milstein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Lighthouse. Lighthouse makes it easy and profitable for commercial building owners to significantly cut their carbon footprints. And I founded the company a decade ago with my physics lab partner from Harvard. But actually, Raphael and I grew up 5 blocks apart and have been best friends since kindergarten. So 30-something years now, which has been pretty fun.
Wow, that's an incredible story. It really is. And Lighthouse first appeared on my radar after I learned that you reinvented the energy efficiency industry to end nearly 70% of carbon emissions in cities that come from buildings. But for people tuning into this podcast and hearing about you for the first time, can you just tell me a little bit more about that and set the scene?
Yeah, absolutely. So commercial and industrial buildings globally are responsible for, it depends on the country, but about 30 to 40% of global CO2 emissions. In cities, that number is much higher, so often 70% or even 80%, depending on the city. And most of those buildings, so globally, again, about 70%, are third-party owned. Namely, there's a landlord that owns the building and they lease out space to tenants. And the challenge in those buildings is that to date, no one has been able to effectively work in them and reduce CO2 emissions substantially. So the largest single source of emissions in pretty much all cities and generally globally overall is completely unaddressed. So Lighthouse focused on that sector, commercial buildings, and especially ones that are third-party owned. Namely, there's a landlord who leases space to tenants, and figured out how to make it extremely profitable and very easy for landlords to cut the emissions of the buildings.
And as a result, Lighthouse is now on this mission to stop climate change by making it easy and profitable for building owners to eliminate carbon emissions caused by wasted energy. But can you tell me a little bit more about what goes on under the hood and how you're actually leveraging technology to do just that?
Yeah, absolutely. So technology has been a huge part of our growth from the very beginning. And it has enabled us to grow much faster than, way faster than otherwise would have been possible. So since launch, we've doubled revenue and CO2 impact every other year now for a decade. So about the same as Moore's Law. And to date, we have eliminated the emissions of about 8.5 power plants. So by the way, we track power plants. That leaves about 49,991.5 left to go. So there's plenty of work left to stop climate change, but so far so good. The way in which we use technology is a fewfold. The first is we are able to deliver 10 to 30% whole building energy savings without replacing any major equipment. So we're not replacing boilers, we're not ripping off windows and putting new windows on like that. Instead, we use sensors and data and software and controls to make all the existing equipment operate much more efficiently. And so we can get these very large savings, 10 to 30% whole building savings, but without any equipment. And that makes it extremely cost effective, which is a big part of how we're able to get landlords to move so quickly to reduce their emissions.
And you were established in 2010, and the company in that time has served 650 buildings and have eliminated, like you said, 8.5 power plants and generally delivered 10 to 30% energy savings and an incredible 10 to 30% ROI as well. But on this tech podcast, I also like to find out a little bit more about the very human story behind a company. And you did mention in your intro about a 30-year friendship. So can you tell me a little bit more about the human story behind Carbon Lighthouse and where it all began?
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways, Carbon Lighthouse began in our kindergarten classroom where Raphael and I first met. So we were pretty close friends right from the beginning. And starting in, I think, first grade is when we started doing minute math. So I don't know if you guys had this in England, but minute math is where you were given a bunch of math problems in 60 seconds. Wow. And, whoever could solve the most math problems in 60 seconds won. And I always came in second because Raphael always beat me. And that was true starting in first grade through something like fourth or fifth grade when minute math curriculum came to an end. But we had always talked about, maybe not always, but probably starting in middle school or maybe fourth or fifth grade, we'd always talked about different companies we wanted to start, and always with an eye towards saving the world in some way. So keep in mind, we were growing up in Berkeley, California. So saving the world, is top of mind for a bunch of hippies. So that always informed us greatly. I went to a public high school, and that is where I became very passionate about climate change. And the reason actually was not one of liberal hippie goodness. It was more one of giving up on low-income education. So Berkeley High School, when I went there back in the 90s, so this was before the first dot-com bubble, Berkeley was a very different place than it is now. It wasn't nearly as gentrified. It was much more mixed. And there's only one public high school. So it was sons and daughters of professors' kids and a lot of kids from parts of town who were really struggling and very little in the middle. Very little in the middle. So to put some statistics to this, my freshman class of 1,000 graduated a little under 700 kids. So not a great graduation rate. We had 6 principals in my 4 years and 20 fires, one of which burnt down a building. So it was pretty chaotic. And I spent a lot of time in high school really failing to help anyone around me. I was in low-income tutoring programs and after-school programs, and neither of them, from what I could tell, really worked at all. Like there was no way that I could see to close what was called the achievement gap. But my senior year of high school, I took a nuclear engineering class at UC Berkeley, and for the first time really learned about climate change and also learned about all these ways to solve it. And completely different than education, we could align the financials. Like, unlike these low-income tutoring programs, we could just pay people to do the right thing. And that was amazing. So figuring out how to pay people to stop climate change has been my cause ever since. So I went off to Harvard to study physics. Raphael, who had abandoned me for private high school, but it's okay, we worked through that, joined me at Harvard, and we were physics lab partners together. And after college, he went off to found a solar company. I worked in energy policy in the state of New York for a couple years. We both went to grad school and then reunited to found Carbon Lighthouse.
And I'm curious, do you ever return to those 1-minute math competitions? Or have you let it go now?
Oh, no, I've let that go. There's some battles you can win, like literally saving the world and stopping climate change. And there's some battles you can't win, like ever beating Rafi at minute math.
Love it. I've got to ask as well, what about the name? Where did the name come from?
All right, I need to make up a better story, but I haven't done that in the past 10 years. I'll just continue to tell the real story, which is it was the least bad name we could come up with for which the URL, namely the domain space online, was still available. I'll quote our quite brilliant head of marketing, JJ. But when Jennifer joined, I asked her if we had to change the name. She thinks about it and sort of mulls it over for a minute and says, "No, at least you gave me a visual element to work with. I kind of like lighthouses." And thus we have our name for good.
Excellent. Well, I think it is a cool name. You know what it is, and I don't know anybody that doesn't like lighthouses. I think most people I've spoke to have professed a desire to stay in one at least one night for an experience. So I think you've got something on your hands there.
Yeah, well, better to be lucky than skilled, I would say, when it comes to naming companies.
Now, I think it's important to highlight that you're not consultants. You don't sell equipment, software, or dashboards. So can you expand on how you're using deep data and also ongoing optimization and also engineering this sophisticated mix of proprietary software and energy efficiency technology? Because it's incredibly exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, to answer that, let's start at the end, which I also think is the easiest way to cut through the marketing hype, which is what our actual contract deliverable is. So there's a bit of irony here, which at least we appreciate. But when we were first starting the company, we looked around the world to figure out who had changed the way the entire world used energy in just a few short decades, because that's all we have to stop climate change. And sadly, the answer to this question is not renewable energy companies, it's oil and gas. And oil and gas, from the first commercial oil well in about 1859 or 1860, when that was completed, to when oil had completely changed the world, was just a few decades. And Standard Oil from the mid 1860s to 1890 or so, by 1890, they had something like 85% of total global oil flowing through their pipes. So it was just this incredible success. And Standard Oil did a lot of things, but they did two things in particular that are completely anathema to the energy efficiency industry. And then the first actually is accountability, and the second is what their contract deliverable was. So on the accountability, Standard Oil, what the word standard means was that any gas station you went to in the world that had Standard Oil, that was a standard gas station, gave you a certain quality of product. Now that's what standard meant. It was the same thing everywhere. And then on the accountability side, if you brought a gallon bucket that was empty to the gas station and you pumped what the machine said should be a gallon into it, and it was only half full, you had someone to sue. And so there was this very high and consistent quality standard, and there was very clear accountability in the transaction. You weren't paying for the derrick, you weren't paying for the test well, you weren't paying for the pipeline, the refining, you were just paying for the gas you used. That's it. And that's actually the business model Carbon Lighthouse adopted right from the beginning, which is we don't sell consulting reports. We don't actually even sell a software license, although we've spent a few tens of millions of dollars building software over the past decade. We don't sell equipment with a markup. We just sell energy savings. So our contract deliverable is a dollar amount of savings resulting from reductions in energy use. And we charge a fixed monthly fee in exchange for that. So if savings are greater than expected, the client keeps it. And if they're less than expected, we write a check to cover the difference. That's the contract.
Fantastic. And we have spoken about how you're transforming the way energy is used in commercial buildings and also how it's one of the most impactful ways to make a difference. But do you have any client stories or use cases that will just help people listening understand the whole process and how you're changing the world for the better by using technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's use an example that I think probably all of your listeners will recognize the client for, which is Tesla Motors. So Tesla was actually one of our earlier clients, and everyone will be unsurprised to know, they take their building engineering as seriously as they take their car engineering. And with Tesla, the very first buildings we worked in with them were pretty mission critical buildings for them. So they hold Tesla's battery testing plant, as well as Dynalab, which is how they test the powertrains on the Teslas. So it also had some office space. So it's a mixed-use building, and it was extremely efficient to begin with. So the whole building was newly built and commissioned just a few years before we got in there. And then, it's full of Tesla engineers. And then before we started work with them, they had hired not one, but two of the best energy efficiency firms they could find to help them get even further along. So this building was squeaky clean. And when Carbon Lighthouse came in, our system, thank the Lord, I would say, is actually based on a premise of humility, which is if we have the same information as everyone else, we can't hope to find different results. And so the very first thing we do is deploy hundreds of sensors in a client's mechanical rooms, on the roof, in their electrical panels, that sort of thing, to get a huge amount of data that has never before existed. So this is data like electrical flow through individual circuits, but it's also fluid flow, so chilled water flow and heating water flow, airflow rates, pressures all over the place, light levels, occupancy levels, CO2 levels in the building. It's this massive amount of data. And all of that data feeds into our software. And the software is looking for two things. The first is what are the one-time changes we can make to the building to save energy use? So like lighting retrofits. And the second thing is the ongoing optimization. And this is where, outside of lighting, about 80% of our energy savings come from. And ongoing optimization, this is a fancy way of saying turning things slightly up and slightly down every 5 minutes. So you can kind of think of it as like getting your car tuned up, but automatically and in real time. So what the software lets us do is figure out how to do things like, Tesla for their battery plant, they have to make it really hot and then make it really cold and then make it really hot and make it really cold so that they can test the batteries and cycle them and see how they perform in different weather conditions. So what our software is letting us do is say, okay, right now this room needs it to be very hot. And the most efficient way to do that is to actually turn the boiler down a little bit, which will save a lot of energy, but then it'll create a penalty at the pumps because we're going to pump a lot more water, but net that'll save 25%. And then 10 minutes later, as the building changes and the people move around and the weather changes, the system makes a new automatic little tune-up like that. So rather than needing to replace whole equipment, we're just slightly tweaking how all the existing equipment works. But those small changes have very large differences in energy use. And so similarly to our other buildings, at Tesla, we were able to deliver, I think we got 12% whole building energy savings, despite how efficient that building was to begin with, without any major new equipment.
So for any business leaders listening that completely get everything that we're talking about and they too want to explore how they can play a part against climate change, what does it actually take to turn an ordinary office building into an energy efficient workspace?
Yeah. So the first thing it takes is a mind shift. Yeah. And the mind shift is actually really exciting. which is if you looked at this even 5 years ago, the numbers were completely different. Whereas now things are very substantially profitable. So across a portfolio, on average, we're boosting value of a building by, call it $5 a square foot. So across a portfolio of 10 million square feet, the opportunity to reduce your emissions is worth $50 million of new profit. So that's the important thing to recognize first, is that you shouldn't be doing this out of the goodness of your heart. You should be doing it because you will make a boatload of money. And thus, as a business leader, you can prioritize it. And so that's really important if we're going to move fast enough to stop climate change. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing is, if your building's in the US, all you need to do is call us. We can do all the work for you. We take all the financial risk. We can even front all the money. So it's very simple if you're in the US. So first, realize it's profitable. Second, call us. If you're outside the US, sadly, Carbon Lighthouse is not a fit for you. So then there's a little more work to do. And that's relevant because the work is challenging because there's very few other firms with our contract structure, and that's really important. So I'd say the work that needs to be done is to find vendors who are willing to stand behind financially what they're promising. And that's unfortunately challenging. So the hurdle here is, if you're outside the US and you can't just call us, you're going to call firms and they're going to promise you the moon, and their contract deliverable is going to be completely unrelated. So they'll say, oh yeah, hire us, we'll save you $100,000 a year, but their contract deliverable will be for a consulting report. Or they'll say, oh yeah, use our software, it'll save you $100,000 a year, but their contract deliverable will be for a piece of software, not a dollar amount. So I'd say to building owners, first, realize it's profitable to do this, and then second, find a firm who will put the dollar amount of the value they are promising you into the contract. And once you've done those two things, then it's pretty easy.
I'm curious, are you noticing more and more businesses wanting to take responsibility for their scale and indeed carbon footprint?
Yes, actually, yes, very much. And I think it's related to technology, because I think technology is doing two things that are really important. The first is they're cutting the cost that is required to reduce emissions so that it's actually profitable now. But there's a second thing technology is doing, which is as or potentially more valuable. And that is, technology is making it possible to measure and actually hold people accountable to what they have promised when it comes to sustainability. So greenwashing, or pretending to do something useful for the planet, is getting eliminated by tech, because it's so easy to look at the utility bills and say, hey, these didn't go down. So I don't know whether you're incompetent or lying, but what you have promised wasn't delivered. And so technology is adding a layer of transparency and accountability to the energy efficiency industry in particular that I think is amazing. And because of that, business owners are willing to take more action because they're playing in a marketplace, which actually can provide some amount of accountability where, a decade ago it couldn't.
And as for you and your team there, what is your grand vision for Carbon Lighthouse, especially as we enter a new decade? And also, what role will technology continue to play in that?
I'm so glad you asked. All right. So the mission of Carbon Lighthouse remains completely unchanged from a decade ago, which is stop climate change.
Yeah.
And our ethos for doing this also remains unchanged, which is there are $7 trillion per year spent on fossil fuels, which means we need to become incredibly large incredibly quickly if we're going to actually matter for the planet. And we believe the only way to do that is to do work that's very profitable for clients and also profitable for ourselves. So the general ethos of the company is, if it makes money for customers, it makes money for us, and it reduces emissions, it's on the table. And if it doesn't check all three of those boxes, it's not on the table. So that's a pretty large sandbox in which to play. So we started just with energy efficiency, just with schools and office buildings. As the cost of solar came down, we added that into our offering as well. Over the next couple years, I'm expecting the cost of batteries to come down, so we can add that into our offering as well. That's particularly exciting because it means we can start making a bunch of buildings completely net neutral and actually taking them off grid entirely. So that's a huge deal, which I expect to start happening over the next few years. We've also been expanding product types. So it's not just office buildings and schools, it's office buildings and schools and retail and industrial and hospitality. So hotels and motels and resorts. So that expansion will continue. And we've been expanding geographies. So we have offices in San Francisco, LA, Honolulu, New York. We're opening Washington, DC, and Boston over the next 6 months. And over the 18 months after that, we'll open some mix of Dallas, Chicago, Denver, and Miami. So that puts us within about a 4-hour drive of 85% of the population of the US. And then after that, we'll start licensing the software we use internally, internationally, so that we can start reducing emissions outside the US. So it's going to be an exciting 5 years here.
Wow, not only exciting, incredibly busy. I love the ambition here. And for anyone listening that would like to find out more information and keep up to speed with your progress, can you just point them in the direction of where they can find you online and also contact your team if they do have any questions?
Yep, it's www.carbonlighthouse.com. And there's a newsletter that will pop up that you can sign up for if you would like. And you can always email info@carbonlighthouse.com if you have questions.
Well, I always say at the end of every episode that technology works best when it brings people together, but you're taking it a step further and actually using it to change the world and help solve climate change, which is fantastic. But I also love at the very heart of all this began with those 1-minute math tests with you and your friend. It really is a fantastic story. So more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to come on and share that with me today. Thank you, Brendan.
Oh, absolutely. And you should meet Raphael in person. He's a smarter, taller, more jovial version of myself.
There is so much I love about this conversation today. And I love how they're transforming the way energy is used in commercial buildings, as it's one of the most impactful ways to make a difference. For example, commercial real estate contributes to 20% of US annual carbon emissions alone. But I also love the company values and how the team highly values question asking, getting it done, integrity and teamwork, and a strive for dynamism and innovation. I think we could all work in an environment like that, couldn't we? And thrive. Not to be motivated by big paychecks, but actually using tech to make a difference to this mutual home that we all share here on planet Earth, rather than trying to escape it like Elon Musk, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos. But before I go all ranty on you, it's time for you to share your thoughts, your insights on today's episode or anything at all, or even just ask me a question. Please, I invite you to email me directly, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Don't forget, you can visit my website, which is at techblogwriter.co.uk if you want to work with me. Equally, if you just want to keep up to speed with the other written content that I create, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm just at Neil C. Hughes there as well. You should find me nice and easily. But if you have any problems, send me that email. But that's it from me. Thanks so much for taking the time to tune into this podcast. I appreciate each and every one of you more than you could possibly know. So please, reach out and connect with me. I feel a song coming on, so I better sign off quickly. So thanks for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.